Dan, what's happening, man? The internet's not so good. There's no internet.
Yes, speaker.
It's on speaker?
No, it's a guest speaker.
Can you guys hear me okay? Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay, great. The internet's not so good.
Okay, well, hello everyone in the room and online. Greetings, my name is Shloimy Kleinman. I'm filling in for my brother-in-law, Rabbi Schneer Silverberg. So tonight we're going to study, this week's Parsha has a very special mitzvah, the mitzvah of benching, BIRCHAT HA'MAZON. It says in this week's Parsha, V'achalta, you will eat, V'savata, you'll be satisfied, V'berachtas Hashem Elokecha, and you will bless God, Asher Nasam Lach, who has given you the food, for the land, he's giving you the food. So from this verse, we derive the mitzvah of BIRCHAT HA'MAZON, that is the blessing after food. And so in that spirit, we'll study from the tractate Brachos, and we'll do a little more maybe inside. I know Rabbi Schneer a lot of times just gives the outside over, but I'll study more inside. But for those who don't have the book, I'll say it outside also. But there's two English ones left there. It's going to be on page Mem Zayin and Bezer 47b on the bottom. We're going to start. So, okay. So the Mishnah here, the Mishnah at the beginning of this chapter starts with the laws of what's called zimun. So when we bench after the meal, if we ate a meal together with three other men, you're not allowed to just say the grace, say the blessing after the meal by yourself and leave. You have to say it together as a group with three people. That's what the Mishnah says at the beginning of the 7th chapter in Brachos. It says, Shlosha sha'achlu ka'achas, three people who have eaten together in one meal, chayavim lezamen, they're obligated to bless together in a zimun. And this makes some complications in different scenarios. But generally speaking, if one person, let's say you ate with three people and you washed, and one person needs to leave early, the optimal thing to do is for that one person to make the zimun, to make the blessings together with everyone, and he benches, and then the other two people can continue eating and bench later. But each person that partook in that meal is really obligated to bench, but not only by himself, to bench as part of a group. Then the Mishnah finishes at the end. The Mishnah says, Nashim v'avadim uktanim, women, servants, and minors, ein mezamnin alein, you do not form a zimun, you do not form a group together with them. So we'll start with the Talmud then that dives into that last sentence of the Mishnah. Nashim v'avadim uktanim ein mezamnin alein. It's on Mem Zayin Amud Beis in 47b. And it's where the wide lines start in the Talmud. It's kind of the second wide line. So here the Gemara starts by bringing a contradiction to this Mishnah. Amar Rabbi Yossi says, Katan amutal barisa. If you have a minor and he's so small that he's still in a crib, Mizamnin alav, you could include him in a zimun. If you had a meal that two people ate, and then I guess your wife fed the baby, or the baby already ate a little bread or something. Mizamni, you can include him. You can make already Rabbi Yisrael benchen, even though obviously he can't talk yet. But you already ate a meal with three people. That's what Rabbi Yossi says, or Rav Asi. There's two versions. So the Gemara right away asks, "What's now?" But our Mishnah just finished saying, "Nashim bavad muktanim ein mizamnin alein." You cannot make a zimun with a minor. So the Gemara answers, Hu de Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yossi was following the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. The Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says, Aval Pisha Amru. Even though they have said that a minor who is in a crib, you're not allowed to include him in a zimun. Aval, but nevertheless, you could include him as part of the 10. So there's now the Gemara is introducing us to a new concept that we have a zimun, we have a gathering, or you're benching together with three people, a group of three. And then if you do it with the group of 10, you also say pretty much the same words, but you add a very critical element. You say, Nevarech le'Elokeinu. You add God's name, because it's like you have a minyan. Just like when you come to shul, there's certain things you can only do if you have a minyan. If you have the holiness of a congregation, a quorum. So too when it comes to the benching with a zimun. If you have 10, you could say Elokeinu. So Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is saying, if you only have two people plus a baby, you can't do a zimun. But if you had 9 people plus a baby, that already allows you to say Elokeinu. So this is going to have similarities. If sometimes you've been in a shul, but it never happened here, where you're stuck with only 9 people by a minyan. And for the most part, if you have 9 people, you don't have a minyan. Even though there's a Hasidic tradition from the Baal Shem Tov, who says, if you have 9, you always have 10. That's what the Baal Shem Tov promised, so to speak. You get 9, you're going to get 10. But in certain in certain shuls, especially like where I grew up, like in like the Hungarian shuls, I remember like my great uncle had a shul in Borough Park. I was only like 10 or 11. They had 9. He would give me a chumash, and that was part of the minyan. There's a way to be lenient. Again, we don't do it in Chabad. In Chabad, we're more strict. But in other circles, there's a way to be lenient to say you have 9 plus a katan, and we'll see soon. With something with the davar shebekdusha, holding onto a Torah, holding onto a chumash, you can already make a minyan. This is part of it comes from this Gemara here where it talks about the being mitzvah with the katan. So then you have the Gemara now brings other statements of Rabbi Shloimy Levi that are somewhat similar. He says, Rabbi Shloimy Levi says, Tisha, if you have 9 men, the Eved, and then you have one slave, one servant, whose servant normally is not a full Jew. A servant was somebody who basically converted for under duress or whatever, and he was considered to be like a half Jew for the most part. He couldn't really make quorum. But if you have 9 already, you could use the Eved, you could use the servant. That's what Shloimy Levi says. Meisvei, the Gemara asks a question. Ma'aseh Rabbi Eliezer, there's a story about Rabbi Eliezer. Shenichnas lebeis hakneses. He came into the shul. V'lo matzah asara. He didn't find 10 people, but he had with him his servant. So what did he do? Shichar avdo. On the spot, he freed his servant, and then they had a minyan. That's how they got a minyan. So the Gemara says from that story of Rabbi Eliezer, you see that a servant cannot be included in the minyan. Because if a servant could be included in the minyan, why did Rabbi Eliezer have to free his servant? He could have just said, we have 9 plus a servant. So the Gemara says, so we see from there, shichrer in, if he freed the servant, it would be a minyan. Lo shichrer lo. Yeah, he would become a full Jew. Why do you have to do that? He could have left him be a servant and still had a minyan. According to Rabbi Shloimy Levi, Tisha, 9 people, the Eved with a servant is a good minyan. So the Gemara says, in that case, Trey it's Tzrichu. In that case, really, they only had 8 Jewish men. Really, they only had 8. And he had 2 servants. Shichar Chad, he freed 1 servant, the Nafik B'chad, and then he said, oh, now we have 9 full Jews, and then we have like a half Jew, so that's okay. So he added that other servant was 9 Jews and a servant. Right? Now we have a different question. How is Rabbi Eliezer allowed to do this? He comes into the shul, he sees there's no minyan, and he frees his servants, he frees his slaves. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Call meshachrer avdo over basei." Okay, the Rabbi Yehuda says anyone who frees his servant is transgressing a positive commandment, and this is a little bit of a tricky issue. But basically, in the times of the Talmud, they had, and not in times actually before the times of the Talmud, they had Jewish servants who were full Jews, and they also had non-Jewish servants. A non-Jewish servant you were not allowed to free. It says the olam bahem tavodu. Basically, there was this idea that God didn't want the Jews to make servants amongst themselves. So you should have the non-Jews as the servants, and don't take any Jews as servants ever, and don't free any non-Jewish servants. That was the idea. So it says the olam bahem tavodu. You're not allowed to free a servant. So how is Rabbi Eliezer? He needs a minyan. How is he allowed to free a servant? So the Gemara answers the bar mitzvah shani. He was doing it to do a mitzvah. You're not allowed to free your servant just to be a nice guy. You're not allowed to do it just to be a nice guy, I guess. But to do it for a mitzvah's sake, you're allowed to do it. And what about this? Freeing the servant, is that a mitzvah? Okay, whatever. And that's a different question. But anyways, to make a minyan, you would be allowed to do it. The Gemara asks, well, we know it's a mitzvah babadei. There's a concept that you do a mitzvah you do an avera in order to do a mitzvah. It's not considered a mitzvah, really. A very easy example to understand: if somebody steals a lot of money and then he gives a lot of charity, that's called a mitzvah babadei. It's a mitzvah that came with. It's a tarnished mitzvah. It doesn't really count as a mitzvah because you only did the mitzvah by doing an avera. In some cases, the mitzvah doesn't even count altogether. For example, if a person was to steal an esrog or a little of an esrog and shake it on Sukkot, he didn't even fulfill his obligation. If someone steals money, technically it's considered a mitzvah, but obviously it's a very tarnished mitzvah. And in fact, there's discussion in the Shulchan Aruch about certain times of the year from certain people where you're not allowed to accept charity from them. because it was so common that they would be involved in ethically questionable business practices, certain types of merchants or whatever. Like, you have to wait 90 days for that money to flush out of the system, and then you can start accepting charity. So the Gemara is asking us a similar question here. Okay, he comes in, he sees he's got a problem, he doesn't have a minyan, he wants to do a mitzvah, so he's free as a slave, but that's an avera. So how's he allowed to take advantage of doing a mitzvah above avera? So the Gemara answers an interesting answer. It says mitzvah derabim shani. It depends. If you're doing a mitzvah for yourself by freeing your slave, that's a problem. Mitzvah above avera. But here, in your calculation, it's a tarnished mitzvah. But what about everybody else? For the other 8 people in the minyan, they didn't do anything wrong. They were just participants. So that basically, if you like, it's almost like if you have a scale, the guy who freed the slave, he has 1 against 1. He has an avera, but he has a mitzvah. So maybe it offsets. But the other people in the minyan, they didn't do any avera. So for them, it's just a mitzvah. So it's just a net positive. So therefore, if it's a mitzvah derabim, if you're helping multiple people, then it's a little bit of a different calculation. Again, it's not clear how widespread you can apply this. Like, can you say you steal money and then you build a hospital for everyone or whatever? I don't know. But that's not so clear. But this is an interesting Gemara, the way it answers this problem.
But again, we have another argument that he's basically doing something against the Oraita to do something that is maybe the Rabbanan.
Okay, interesting question. You're saying maybe it's a Doraisa and this is a Rabbanan?
It's a say.
It must be that it wasn't like it wasn't the Doraisa. It must be that it was just considered a Rabbanan. Like I don't remember the exact categories, but it must be.
Did you say that there is an opinion that it's in violation of Mitzvot Aseh when he frees?
Over best say. The Gemara says over best say. He's transgressed an essay, but I think you're right. It must be that it means like Midrabanan or whatever. It must be. It could be because of the time, because like there was no temple. I don't know. It must be that it was only a rabbinic issue.
The 10, then he brings Dusha, and then it's considered as the Oraita. That he's doing.
It's hard to say that because I don't know. There's no mitzvah d'oraisa to have a minyan,
Not to have a minyan, but to bring the Shekhinah to.
Could be. That's another good answer. It's a good question. I don't know the answer. Let's see. Maybe this is a long bach here. Maybe it isn't. Okay, interesting. Okay, now he raises a different question. He talks about there's another strange category of a person where one person was a servant to 2 masters, and then one of the masters frees him. So that person is called the Chatzi Eved, the Chatzi Ben Chora. And he had a category, he was half servant, half Jew. He had one person, and it was almost like he split his body in half. He was half Jewish, half non-Jewish. So the question, the Talmud in a different tractate says, if a person is the part owner of a slave like this, he's obligated to free the other half a slave. You're not allowed to, as the owner, you have to free the rest of them. Why? Because half of him has a mitzvah to get married and build a Jewish home. But he can't, because no woman's allowed to marry him because he's half non-Jewish or whatever. He's like a quarter, I guess. He's a half non-Jew or whatever. So you're obligated to free him. So the question is, well, that's also a mitzvah above avera. That's the question. This Talmudic statement says that if you free a slave in order to make a minyan, it's a mitzvah above avera. So why don't you say the same thing there? Why do you force the guy to free the half a slave? Why don't you say when he frees the half a slave, he's doing an avera, and now he's doing a mitzvah? So the answer the Bach brings, the Bach is Rabbi Yoel Sirkish, 16th century scholar. The answer the Bach brings is that, well, the truth is that the guy who did you're already in a pickle because the first owner who freed half of him already did it wrong. In other words, he already did half the avera, so it's really that guy's fault. Once you're in the position, you have to just finish it off and let him do the mitzvah. A slave is really Jewish. In order for a Jew to have a slave, they have to be Jewish. It's just that when you convert a slave, you're really coercing him to convert. That's the way it worked. Like you didn't give, but if the slave refused, if the slave said, "I'm not accepting the mitzvahs no matter what," then basically you had to let him go. You had to sell him back to non-Jews. In order for a Jew to keep a non-Jewish slave, they had to accept a certain level of Torah. It's just that because they didn't do it willingly, they were kind of coerced into it. So therefore, the Torah says they only have a status of like a half Jew, meaning they're only obligated to do certain mitzvahs. They're not obligated to do all mitzvahs, and they can't marry regular Jews. They can only marry they can only basically marry other servants in the same category. None of these really apply anymore because we live in a very, very different society, and then I don't, no one in today's day and age would say it's a mitzvah to have a slave, to practice this way. It's just for the concept of like how you think about mitzvah b'avera, or it's still interesting. I mean, to some degree, you could, anyway, it doesn't matter. Rabbi Shloimy Levi says, this is similar to what you said in the time. Forever, Yashkim Adam Lebeit HaKnesses, a person should wake up early to come to shul, so that he should be Zoche v'yimnem asar rishonim, that he should be counted with the first 10 people who come into shul. Shafilu me'ah ba'am acharav, even if 100 people come in after him, kibul of schar kulam, the first 10 people get the reward of everyone. That's the original statement. The Gemara challenges that. Schar kulam is it possible that everybody else who comes to shul, 90 people don't get any reward and the first 10 get everything? It doesn't feel right. It's like a win-lose situation. So the Gemara says, no, it's win-win. The Gemara says it's win-win. He says, rather, the first 10 get the same reward as all the 90. In other words, every person who comes to shul, say, gets $10 a reward, whatever. So 90 people would have 900 or whatever the math works out to be. And then those first 10 people also get 900. They get as much as everybody else. Why? Because they were the ones, like Matan said, when 10 people come, then you bring the Shekhinah, then you bring the Shekhinah. So from here, there's the importance of making a minyan. In addition to the importance of davening, of praying with a minyan, there's a special importance given to making a minyan. So especially here now, we get texts from a lot of different shuls. They will come, we need a minyan, a Kaddish, one for Kaddish here, 2 minions, 3 minions. So at the end of the day, every minyan, you are bringing down the Shekhinah into the world, which is a very, very special thing, as we see here from the statement of Rabbi Shloimy Levi. And now we have another statement about a minyan. He says, Rav Huna says, Tisha, you have 9, the Aron, and you have the Ark, Mitzdarfen, a minyan. Like the saying about Shem. You have 9, you basically have a minyan. Tisha, you have 9, the Aron, you have the Aron Kodesh, Mitzdarfen, you have a minyan. Rav Nachman said, Aron Gabru, is the Ark a person? Rav Huna, rather Rav Huna said, that's not what he meant to say. He meant to say, Tisha, if you have 9, but Nirim Ka'asara, it looks like 10, it's Starford. You only 9 people in the room, but when you count them, you kind of think they're 10. You already have a minyan. How do you get to that level? Hey, you say a little L'chaim. No. No, the Gemara will explain. How do you get to the level of 9 that looks like 10? The Gemara has a dispute about it. Some people say, well, if 9 people all stand very close together, then somebody coming in would say, oh, they've got a minyan, because you kind of, whatever, you double count someone. The other opinion says the opposite. If the 9 people are all spread out, then you start counting. By the time you get around, you forget which number you're holding, so you say, oh, they have a minyan. Yesterday, we had an interesting situation where we had 2 minions here, and each one thought they had 10, but at the end, there was really only 19 people, so we were like, one guy was going in and out. It was an interesting scenario. But this statement from the Talmud kind of, each one thought they had a minyan, so maybe that's good enough. None of this is the halacha, obviously. None of this is the halacha, follows. You need 10 men, you ask the rabbi what to do, etc. This is just the Talmudic, the meat behind the halacha. Rami now says, now we're going back to Zimun. Now we're going back to benching. Rami says like this, Shnayim the Shabbos, if you have 2 people eating a meal together, but it's on Shabbos, it's Starfin, it's considered as if you have 3 people. Shabbos is like the guest. Nachman says, Shabbos Gabru, is Shabbos a human being? Rami says he meant something else. If you have 2 Torah scholars eating together, but they sharpen each other, then it's like the sum of the parts, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts or whatever. Because they sharpen each other, that's like the third person. From between the 2 of them, you're coming up with something new, right? Because each one is basically sharpening the other. And through debate, you arrive at a deeper truth. That deeper truth is like a new creation, almost like a third person. So you could have a zimun if you have 2 Torah scholars that are debating in the halakha over a meal, they could already make a zimun by themselves. Machvir Rav Chisda said, another Rav Sheshes, like me and Rav Sheshes, and Rav Sheshes said, like me and Rav Chisda. Okay. We're an example of like a peer of scholars that would debate and be able to have a zimun on their own. Rabbi Yochanan, here we have Rabbi Yochanan says, Katan pareach. If you have a minor, but he's bubbling up. He's sometimes you have like a bubble list, like, oh, this guy's ready to go to the next level. And like in sport, I don't know, in sports stuff, they have a bubble list, like he's ready to, I don't know how that works. Whatever, in corporate America, we have like a bubble list, like, oh, this guy's he's ready to kind of, bubble. He's ready to go up. So Katan pareach, I have a minor, but he's like, everyone sees that he's got hair on his chest, so to speak. He's ready. In Mizamin Alav, you could already include him. He doesn't have to be 13 strict. Again, he's 12, but he's there. Tani Namiyachi, the Bryce also says that Katan Shehevi Shtei Cyrus, a Katan who has brought 2 pubic hairs, Mizamin Alav, you can make him as part of the Zimun. If he doesn't have 2 pubic hairs, Mizamin Alav, you don't include him. But it says you're not that careful when it comes to the minor. In other words, you don't use a microscope to measure if he has hair or not. It says this Bryce doesn't make any sense. You start out by saying if you brought 2 hairs, good. If not, not. And then you say, you're not very careful. So which one is it? So he says, it's coming to include a katan who doesn't necessarily have the pubic hairs, but he's already the age. You basically see he's there already. The less hilchasa kachah and yishmaitza, the halacha does not follow any of these very interesting statements we just said. Ella rather, kihadam Rav Nachman, like Rav Nachman said. A minor, as long as he knows who you are benching to, you can include him in the zimun. Again, we don't follow this halacha. In the times of the Talmud says this is halacha. Even though the Mishnah says you don't include a katan in the zimun, the Talmud says no. If you have a minor, but he knows who he's benching to. In other words, he understands the concept of a god. You can include him in a zimun. And the Gemara,
They know.
Right, exactly. That's what the Gemara is saying. It doesn't have to be a katan pareach. It doesn't have to have close to. He doesn't have to have hair in his chest. As long as he knows he's benching to God, you can include him. Abaye, the Gemara now brings a story. Abaye and Rava were Yasmi coming to Rabba. Both Abaye and Rava were students as young children, and they were sitting in front of their teacher. His name was Rabba. So this is a little tricky, but in the Talmud you have one Amora whose name was Rava. It ends with an Aleph. And he was a student of the teacher. His name was Rabba. It ends with the Hey. So Abaye and Rabba were colleagues, and they were sitting in front of Rabba. They were minors. Amr Rabba asked them, who are you benching to? Amr Rahmana, they said to God. And he asked them, Rahmana Hichayasif, where's God sit? Where is God? Rabba Achvi Lishmeitlala. So Rabba pointed up to the sky, and Abaye Nafak Levara. Rabba pointed to the sky, I guess, from inside the house. Abaye went outside and he pointed to the sky outside. Amr Rabba told both of them, you are both going to be great Torah scholars. I guess Abaye and Rabba were young enough that it was a surprise that they would be able to answer that way. So pick an age, but at like 3 years old, they were already, they were already able to say, like, oh yeah, we know where God is. So that's the Talmud here, and then it ends off with a very interesting statement. Hainu do Amri Inshi. This is what people say. Butzin mikatfe yediyah. Butzin is a small. Butzin is it's a pumpkin or a gourd. Yes, thank you. A gourd. You can tell what type of gourd it's going to be when it's very small. When it's very small, you can already tell if it's going to be a good pumpkin or a bad pumpkin. And I'm not a pumpkin grower, but that was the saying in those times. The common saying was, pumpkin, you can tell from when it's very small if it's going to be good or not. And basically, a Torah scholar from a very young age, you can tell if like the kid has it or not. Fine. So now let's continue. Now the Gemara is going to get to a little bit of a different topic, but also related to Zimun. Rav Yehuda, the son of Rav Shmuel bar Shila, says in the name of Rav, Tisha achlu dagan. If you have 9 people who ate grain, who ate bread, the echad achal yarak, and only one, so you have 10. But one of the people didn't eat bread. One of the people ate a vegetable. So if you only eat a vegetable, you don't bench. That's the issue. You only bench. You only say that if you ate a meal that contains one of the 5 breads, one of the bread made of one of the 5 grains. For the most part, basically bread. If you eat bread, you wash, you make hamotzi, and then you bench afterwards. And then you're obligated to do this communal benching. But if you only ate a vegetable, you're not obligated to do the communal benching. So here, though, what he's saying is, but if 9 people ate bread and 1 ate a vegetable, you could still make that communal benching, and you could still say God's name. And that is the halacha, that is our practice. And the Gemara will explain later that as long as you have, I think, 6 people who ate bread, you could say Elokeinu. That's why if you're ever by like a shalosh shudas or like a communal meal, and they're asking around who ate bread, raise their hand, it's because they're trying to get a count. Like, do we have 6 men who ate bread so we could say the Elokeinu? So you sometimes you see that, you might not know what it is. That's why they're doing that. That's how you get the quorum to say Elokeinu. Amr Abzera says, okay, the Gemara is right here. They asked a question from you, Shmoina Mao, Shiva Mao. What happens if you had 8 who ate bread? What happens if you have 7 who ate bread? Amr Le Loishna. He said it doesn't matter. 6, 9, 8, 7 doesn't matter. You could still make Elokeinu. But Shisha Vadar Lemibayli, 6 I wouldn't dare to ask because I wouldn't think that you could do it with 6. Amr Le Rabbi Yirmiyah said, Shaper Vadar, it was proper that you didn't ask about 6. Hasam time Mishum Diko Ruba. So the Gemara says, why? Because as long as you have most of a minion, it should be good. In other words, why do you need 7? Why is 7? If you're saying 9 is good because you're most of the way there. If you have 8, you're also most of the way there. If you have 7, you're also most of the way there. If you have 6, you should also be most of the way there. So the Gemara says, no, that this opinion, this scholar held that Ruba de Minkabin, you need a recognizable majority. It's not enough to have a majority with 1. You need like at least 2 in the, you need at least 7 people. I believe that halacha is. I believe that what we do is as long as you have 6 who washed, we will say Elokeinu. Now the Gemara brings a very interesting story of Yanai Malko Malkasa. You had King Yanai. You had at the end of the Chashmonaim. The Chashmonaim were in the times of the Second Temple, when the Greeks, the story of Hanukkah, the Greeks basically were running the show, and then you had the Chashmonaim who led a rebellion, and they conquered Israel back, and there was a Chashmonai kingdom that lasted for not a very long time, but for maybe 40 or 60 years, I don't exactly know the history, but for a certain number of years during the Second Temple, the land of Israel was under Jewish rule. For most of the tenure of the Second Temple, even though we had a temple, the land of Israel was still like paying taxes and under the dominion of foreign countries, either Persia, Greece, Greek, or at the end Rome. But for that short period of time, or I think 40, 60 years or whatever, it was under Jewish rule. And towards the end of the Chashmonai period, you had a king named Yanai. And the issue with Yanai was that somehow, and the Chashmonai we know were Kohanim, we know they were priests. And that was one of the issues. One of the issues was that they were priests and they were very brave and they were very strong, great warriors. But then once they got power, they basically got drunk on power. And even though, according to Torah law, the king has to be from the tribe of Judah, they weren't willing to relinquish the power that they had established and appoint a king from Judah. They took the kingdom for themselves, and that was the issue. They were priests, so they weren't really allowed to be Jewish kings. But that's what happened. They appointed themselves as, they won and they appointed themselves as king. And again, it didn't last for long. And one of the spiritual reasons given for their demise was this mistake that they didn't appoint a king from Judah. But anyways, so at one point, I think that one of them had intermarried or something. This Yanai wasn't fully Jewish, and therefore he wasn't allowed to serve in the temple as a king. But he was the king, and everyone was afraid of telling him that. But then eventually he realized that the rabbis were not happy with him. The rabbis didn't recognize him as a priest, and he got really angry, and he basically killed all the rabbis in his era. So this is Yanai Malka, Yanai the king, Umalkasa, and his wife the queen. Now, his wife, the queen, he was married to a woman who was a sister of Reb Shimon ben Shetach, who was one of the most famous Torah scholars. And she knew what was going on, and she hid her brother. So you had Reb Shimon ben Shetach, who survived like this massacre of all the sages. He was the last man standing. So Yanai Malko Malkasa Krichu Riftabadi Adadi, they were having a meal together. And apparently, they were all very ignorant. Because they had killed all the sages, they didn't have anyone to lead the benching. Nowadays, everyone knows how to pretty much, you know how to bench. Like you just sing the song, or you can go to Chabad.org, you can probably play it for you. You can play it on the internet. But King Yanai didn't know how to bench. And he realized it was a problem. He told his wife, who could bring up a man, a dead man from the grave that can lead us in benching? There's no one left who can do this. Amrele, she told him, Mishtavali, swear to me, that if I bring you a person, you're not going to kill him. You're not going to pain him. If I find you someone, if I can bring you someone, will you harm him? Ishtabali swore to her because he didn't believe that there was anyone left. I see Achba. She brought out Shimon Meshatach, her brother. She sent the tweet, she sent the messenger bird, Shimon Meshatach, come out of his hiding, and he came to the palace. He sat in between him and her. So in other words, you had Yana, you had Shimon Meshatach, and then you had his sister, the queen. Amrle. He said to him, Chazis, Kama Yukara Abdinalach. So I think this is that the king Yanai told Shimon Meshatach, look at how much I am honoring you. In other words, look at how much respect I'm giving you. Shimon Meshatach said, Lav you're not giving me respect, but rather it's the Torah that's giving me respect. It's not clear to me why Shimon Meshatach wanted to start up with Yanai, but that's what the Talmud says. And he brings him a verse. So Yanai told his wife, you see that he doesn't accept my authority. In other words, basically, even after Yanai really wanted to kill him, but he basically had promised his wife that he wouldn't, so he felt that he couldn't. So he says, but he complained to her about it. They immediately brought out a cup of wine, so Shimon Meshatach should make the benching. Why? Because again, this is something that isn't necessarily commonly practiced, but there's this idea that when you make BIRCHAT HA'MAZON, when you make the benching, you should do it on a cup of wine. And what that means is that when you say the Rabbos and benching, you hold a cup of wine just like by Kiddush, and you hold it in your hand until after Bonei Barachma Yerushalayim, then you put it down, and then after you finish benching, you make the Bor Pir Geffen, and you drink the wine. Our practice is that that's only done when you have a minyan. When you have 10 people together benching, and you're going to say Elokeinu, that's when we're careful about benching with a cup of wine. Some people are more stringent about it, and even if they're benching with 3, they'll also use a cup of wine. But for the most part, we basically use 10 as like the quorum that will trip us into using a cup of wine. Huh? You say then after bracha on the wine after you drink it. Yeah. Yeah.
What's the reason? Just for an extra blessing?
It's like an opportunity to have a kosher bracha, a cup of blessing. Yeah. That's right. On Pesach by the Seder, where that's the Beirach, the third cup, is the blessing of the wine.
It shifts gears into extending the evening and making a great party. Let's do it. We are 10. Yeah.
That's right. Tonight after the chant, we could do it with the.
Double portion. But I think that only one drink. Right?
Only one person has to drink it, but then you have this concept called like kosher bracha, where other people say, I want to take a sip, because it's considered to be a cup of blessings, because you said the whole benching over this cup. So the cup itself has certain special qualities. Amar, so Shimon Meshatach wasn't going down without a fight here. He said, Hey Chiabrich, what type of, you're bringing me a cup of wine, you're telling me I should bench for you. What am I going to bench on? I should say, Baruch she'achal Yanai v'chaveirav mishalo. I should say, blessed is the one who fed Yanai and his friends. Because basically Shimon Meshatach is saying, you didn't feed me. You dragged me in here. You basically you made fun of me or whatever. And you tell me to bench. I didn't eat anything. So what he did is, Shas Yelo Kasa, Shimon Meshatach drank the cup for himself. And then once he had drank for himself, then he said, then he brought another cup and he said, now I can bench. Because Shimon Meshatach couldn't lead the benching because he said he hadn't eaten anything. So this is another interesting halacha that Shimon Meshatach was saying, I can't bench with you because I didn't eat with you. So you have that sometimes also, that basically, but what we do find, what is interesting is that Shimon Meshatach didn't wash. He just had a hagafen. He just had a cup of wine. And nevertheless, he was willing to bench for everyone else, even though they had eaten bread and presumably he hadn't. That we don't do that. We would only bench nowadays if you had eaten bread, then you're allowed to lead the benching. If you just drank wine or vegetables or something else, you couldn't lead the benching. You could answer. You could be you could be part of the group of 10, but you couldn't lead the benching unless you would have washed yourself. Okay, and then the Gemara says, Amar Baba Shimon Meshatach, that Shimon Meshatach drank the cup of wine and then he benched for everyone. The Gamei Udavar, he just did that according to his own opinion. Because Allah is that you have to eat a kazayas of bread in order to fulfill your obligation. You have to actually eat a kazayas of bread. So he was saying Rav Shimon did according to his opinion, but really that doesn't follow the halacha is not that way. It seemed like he wasn't afraid of speaking up, but yeah, that could be too. Let's skip the page to Memches Amud Beis. You have at the top a very famous statement in the Talmud. Amar Rav Nachman says, Moshe tiken li Yisrael BIRCHAT HA'MAZON. Moses established for the Jews the first blessing of benching. Benching have multiple blessings. The first one came from Moshe. B'shah sheyarad lahem man. When the man came down from heaven, that's when Moshe established the first blessing. Yoshua, however, Joshua tiken lem birchas haaretz. Joshua established the second blessing, which talks about the land. Like, thank you, God, for the land. So Joshua established the second blessing, which talks about the land and food growing from the land. As soon as they entered the land of Israel, Joshua established another blessing for the land. David and Shlomo, who established Jerusalem, Tiknu Bone Yerushalayim, they established the third blessing of Bone Yerushalayim. David just established the blessing that says, on Yisrael, your nation, and on Jerusalem, your city, because David established Jerusalem. But Shlomo then, once he built the Beis HaMikdash, once he built the first temple, he added for your great and holy house. And then you have the fourth blessing in benching, which is called Atov HaMeitiv, and that was established much later. That was established after the destruction of the second temple, B'Yavne Tiknuah. So again, until the times of Yavne, until the destruction of the second temple, basically the benching finished after Uvnei Yerushalayim HaKodesh Me'ir Yemenu, Baruch Atah Hashem Bo Nevarach Yerushalayim Amen. That was the end of benching. Many years later, after the destruction of the second temple in Yavne, they established the fourth blessing. Why? Kineged Arugei Beitar, to thank God for those who were murdered or killed in Beitar. What Beitar was the center of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. So this was, I think, history is not my strong. I think after the Romans already destroyed the second temple, Bar Kokhba then led a rebellion, maybe like 70 years later or so. And he was headquartered or whatever in Beitar. And then eventually the Romans came and they massacred all the Jews in Beitar. And they put a stop to his rebellion. But the Amr of Nasser says, also Yom Shenitnu Aruga Beitar the Gvura, the day that they allowed the people who were killed in Beitar to be buried, Tiknu B'Yavne, they established in Yavne that you should make this fourth blessing in benching, Atov HaMeitiv. And that actually happened on Test of Av. Yesterday was the 15th day of Av. One of the things that happened was on that day, they were allowed to bury the Harugi Beitar, the people who were killed in Beitar, because there was like hundreds of thousands of Jews that were killed, and the Romans didn't allow them to be buried. So they made Atov HaMeitiv, which is like a double good. What was the double good? Atov Shelo Esrichu. It was good. One good is that the bodies didn't rot, even though they were left for a long period of time. The bodies stayed whole. Meitiv, and there was a doubly good. They were allowed to be buried. So that's the four blessings in the benching. That's the history of those. So maybe we'll finish with a short. I didn't bring the book here, so I'll do it from memory. There's a very interesting discourse, Hasidic discourse in Likutei Torah, which is the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe's book of discourses on the weekly portion, and he talks about the idea of benching, the idea of Birchas HaMazon, and it says also before it says you bench, it says that you should know that man does not live on bread alone. Rather, man lives on the words of God. And the Alter Rebbe raises a very interesting question. He says that we know that life in general was classified into four classifications in those times. You had the domem, the inanimate, so which is like rocks and stones and dirt, doesn't move, has no life force. You had someach, which are plants that grow. They don't move, but they grow, or grass, etc. Then you have chai, you have animals that walk around, that are mobile, they grow and they're mobile. And then you have medaber, you have people who speak. And the highest level is medaber, and then the lowest level is the domen, the inanimate. And he raises the question, why is it that a person who's on the highest level, in order for him to get energy, God set it up that he needs to actually eat from the someach, from the vegetative, and from the chai, and from the animal kingdom. It should be the opposite. The man should get his life force directly from God or something, right? Like he's at the top of the food chain. Why is it the top of the food chain, so to speak, needs to get its sustenance from the bottom? Doesn't seem right. So Alter Rebbe says, well, this is being answered by this verse, that man is not getting his sustenance from the bread, because the bread itself, the physical bread, is a much lower plane. But rather, the bread is being created from the word of God. And when you eat the bread, you're tapping into the word of God. And that's what's giving you your true sustenance. So that's kind of the answer to that question. But then the Alter Rebbe says, wait, that doesn't either make sense, because man is also being created by the word of God. So why would man, and man has, presumably a stronger spirit of God within him than the bread would. So why would man, again, need to come out to the word of God that's in the bread if man is on a higher level than the bread is? And the basic answer to this question, it's a very long discourse, and obviously we're going to do it in a very short summary. But the basic answer to this question relies upon a very famous parable or analogy of what's called gavoa gavoa yoter. Whatever is on the highest level, yored lamata mata yoser. When it falls, it's going to fall the furthest away. And the example given is if you have either they hear me or that. But if you have a wall that's let's say 10 feet tall, and then it falls, the stones that were on top of the wall are going to fall, 10 feet, 8 feet, whatever the math works out to be. They're going to fall that far. But if you have a wall that's 100 feet tall, when it falls, the stones are going to fall much, much further. So basically, the idea is that if you see the domen, if you see the tzomeach, you see the chai, you see these what appear to be lower forms of life, you should know that the reason why they're low is because at their source, they started in a much higher level of holiness. They come from actually a much higher level of holiness. They have a much more potent level of holiness. It's just that when they fell into this world, so to speak, they were transformed into something with a much lower form. They have much less life to them. But the truth is that their life source, their true source, if you could see things properly, is from a much higher level of holiness than even humans come from. And that's why a person gets his sustenance from those lower life forms, from grains, from the animal kingdom. Because a person, even though we're the highest form of life, or the highest category of life, in a revealed sense, that's true. But in a subconscious sense, there's actually a deeper form of life in these lower substances. And by eating them, we're basically extracting some of that energy, and we're transforming it, and we're bringing it into our bodies. And that's how we get our energy from. That's the answer. And then in the Kabbalistic terms, the worlds that the Alter Rebbe uses is the world of tikkun, the world of tikkun, olam ha-tikkun, and olam ha-tohu, the world of chaos. So it says in the Kabbalistic descriptions at the beginning of the world that initially when God created the world, it was a world of chaos, meaning everything was all, the lights were so powerful, the energy was so powerful, there weren't vessels that could contain it. And it was like a blazing sun, and it couldn't be stopped, and it just basically exploded. This is like a physical analogy for something very deep. But anyway, so the energy was so powerful that it exploded. That was called the world of chaos. The world of chaos, but eventually broke. From that world, then God said, okay, we need to basically scale back the energy and scale up the vessels so that everything can kind of fit into its right place. That was called olam ha-tikkun, the world of rectification, where God basically limited the energy and created more vessels or more containers for us to be able to receive it. When the world of Toh, the world of chaos shattered, those sparks had so much energy. Those were the sparks that ended up being in the inanimate objects, in the chai, in the tzomeach. And when we eat the food, basically we're tapping into that energy from the world of chaos, and that's how we get our life force. So that is the esoteric meaning behind the mitzvah in this week's parsha of benching, of eating food, but recognizing that the sustenance we get really comes from the deep spiritual energies that are imbued in those objects, and then we bless God for it, and that's also part of the process of elevating those sparks to holiness. So with that, I will conclude tonight's lesson. Thank you all for joining, And thank you online.
Oh yeah, Shloimy. Beautiful. You just closed it.